You have recorded?
No. You want to leave the meeting?
No, no.
You can.
We all have gone through a terrible time. So many friends, family.
Very
they all
true.
lost. Today, Indian Medical Association has said, Delhi Medical, 100 doctors in this wave, in Delhi itself. So they've gone.
Hmm.
So
I
many
know we
nurses.
could sorry. I was just thinking, should we kick off? I think it's a few minutes past 11.
I think we should.
Okay.
Yeah, you're
Thank
right.
you. So Alka and Rajiva, if you want, I can just set this up and give a bit of context. So for those of who I haven't met, my name is Ravi Kriplani, and my wife Sunaina and I moved into Crest in October last year when we were going through our then intense phase of the pandemic. And we were pretty anxious. And just as we thought we were settling in, we've now been hit by this current wave. Alka has said this has been much more intense, and everybody we speak to has had their family or friends impacted. The other aspect is that we've all been flooded with information on regular and social media, which is sometimes conflicting, and it's often difficult to distinguish from what is very important from the stuff that's not so important or probably wrong. So Sunaina, in consultation with some of you, came up with this idea that if we could have a call like this, where we could speak to some experts and have them answer the questions which are uppermost in our minds, it would be really useful. And as a result of that, she reached out to Dr. Alka and Rajiva Gupta, and thanks to them, this call has become possible. What we've done for today is that she reached out to you and got your questions. She's painstakingly compiled them into different groups and sent them across to Alka and Rajiva. So they have already the questions you've raised. So we'll hand over to them in just a minute. I'll just briefly introduce them, and then they will run through your questions, and we will allow some time at the end if you feel something's not been answered or you have an additional question. So now to come to our panel of experts, we're particularly delighted to have with us today Alka and Rajiva Gupta. They are fellow Crestonians. They live in Tower F, and both are have been practicing medicine professionally for more than 40 years. Dr. Rajiva Gupta specializes in diabetology and internal medicine, and Alka in obstetrics and gynecology. They've been strongly associated with Delhi. They've done their MBBS and MD from leading institutions in Delhi like Ram Manohar Lohia Hospital, like Lady Hardinge and Maulana Azad, and have been previously associated with Max Group of Hospitals, are currently associated with Fortis in Shalimar Bagh, but also with CK Birla, Artemis, and Fortis Hospitals in Gurgaon. They've been active members of professional associations, both national and international, in their field of specialization, have invested personally a lot of time in continuing medical education, making professional presentations. So I'm saying all this just to say that they are very eminently qualified to deal
I think
with
we're done now.
So one last aside, which is that I've had the privilege of being personally benefited from Dr. Rajiva's professional advice. And one of the things he said to me is that he's particularly focused on the care for the elderly. When somebody says elderly, I normally think they're thinking about my parents' generation, but sadly it sort of now includes some of us. So we're really truly blessed to have them as fellow Crestonians. And thank you very much for taking this time. I'm going to hand over to Alka.
Hello. So Ravi has so nicely and with such beautiful words he has described, and I always admire him for his perfect diction. And whenever we used to take a walk, I say it's wonderful just to listen to him.
Is there a disturbance?
Are you very close to each other?
Yeah, we are close to each other.
One of you should mute, then we'll be okay. if you mute your sound, one of
We move to one laptop. Better
That'll
if
be
we move to one laptop. I think just close that. Leave that. Okay, I'll start while Rajiv is closing. I'm Dr. Alika, and I'll start with the topic. So at the end of 2019, this novel coronavirus was identified as the cause of a cluster of pneumonias we all know in Wuhan, spread to China and then rest of the world. In February 2020, WHO named it as the coronavirus disease 2019, short form COVID-19. The virus is known as the severe active acute respiratory syndrome, SARS-CoV-2. Different, we all know, we have all read enough, different strains, different mutants came up. Now, the understanding of the COVID-19 disease is evolving. So are the guidelines, and we do not have complete answers. As you all know, most of the medicines which were authorized for this new disease did not come up properly, like the phased up trials, phase 0 to phase 4. They came up suddenly as emergency use authorization. Some went into disrepute, in fact, most of them, and we still don't have a wonder drug. Like we have chloroquine for malaria, we don't have a wonder drug for COVID-19 still. What we answer today will be just expert views. These are not Rajiv's or my views. These are all expert views. I just want to take 2-3 minutes to go through this medical scenario so that you understand what we are answering, how we are answering. So basically what happened when we got out of our MD in 1985, we were just fresh and bubbling with knowledge. And then we started practicing medicine. But early 1990s, we realized we have to go on to a continuing medical education program because in India, we don't have a set rule. Like in America, every 5 years, people have to compulsorily recertify themselves. Here, we don't have to. So we started attending at that time, just few hospitals were there in Delhi, Gangaram, Apollo, and Divan Chand Agarwal at Kasturba Gandhi Marg was doing a beautiful job. We would go there in the afternoon, sit, take our case patients, and we would all sit in groups of small groups of 20-30 doctors and discuss our patients and come back, enlightened, maybe this was better, that was better, this investigation, that treatment modality. But as the 90s evolved, the private sector grew up, hospitals came up. A lot of our faculty from the medical colleges moved out into the private colleges as faculty. And that is where the seminars and the conferences started. And we would spend our weekends every month, at least 2 weekends, sitting at conferences, and our children would get wild, but that was it. We had to go on with the continuing medical education. Then the world changed to the internet and networking. And we became members of a lot of national and international bodies, not because we wanted to have those tamgas on us, only because they would send us journals and updations and all, and we would enjoy and learn more from those. Like Rajiv is the member, obviously, of the Indian Association of Physicians, but also of the American College of Physicians or Endocrinology Society or the Cardiology or Diabetes Association. I am of the Federation of Obs-Gynae of India, but also of the American College of Obs and Gynae. So all this I'm saying because I want to say today we are on to evidence-based medicine. And this we will talk our answers only from the common recommendations and guidelines the world over, that is the CDC, Center for Disease Control of America, or the NICE guidelines, Green Top guidelines, which are given by the NHS of National Health Survey of UK, or WHO, ICMR in Delhi, ICMR in India, and the Ministry of Health and Welfare. Apart from our own bodies who keep updating us as per the rest of the world bodies. So this is what we have followed now for years in our practice, and this is what we are going to speak today. I will start with the questions.
I would just like to mention one thing, that this evidence-based medicine concept came in the early 1990s. because many things were said by people, but experts, by teachers, okay, this is good, but this is bad. But then the scientific community said that we want a proof. So then there were the groups. So one group was given an option A, another group was given an option B, and then they would see whether there is a substantial difference in the outcome in two groups. So that was it statistically significant or not? So that's where and today, in today's time, practically everything which before approval, it goes through these rigorous researches, and then only finally it's approved. And they see that what are the signals. So many times during signal, adverse signals come up. So that's the birth of the evidence-based medicine somewhere in 1990s, early 1990s.
Okay, I'll start with the question. There were about 50 questions. We have clustered them up into groups because many had common answers. So we'll start. So what, Rajiv will answer most of them, I'll answer few. What may be the first symptoms that should alert us to COVID? And is there a way to know if it's not just flu? What should one do right away? What medications can we start on ourselves? Treatment for COVID is very day specific depending on progression of the disease. What should be taken on day one for symptomatic and asymptomatic people?
Yeah, so the COVID-19 is essentially an acute febrile illness. Acute febrile illness means that acute means of a sudden onset, febrile means having fever, and illness is an illness with the predominant symptoms of influenza-like. So it is also called an influenza-like illness. So during the prevalence of the pandemic, when the numbers are so high, so probably every patient who is having influenza-like symptoms turns out to be COVID. Now, what is influenza-like illness? It's a combination of fever and upper respiratory tract symptom. Upper respiratory tract means nose, sinuses, throat. So there could be, in addition to fever, there could be systemic symptoms like muscle aches, body aches, headache, then irritation in the throat, sore throat, cough, sneezing. These are the symptoms. Now, these symptoms would make the patient being labeled as influenza-like illness. However, it is impossible to distinguish just based on these symptoms any other viral illness from COVID-19, except there is one symptom, which is loss of smell. So if loss of smell is there, even in the absence of these symptoms of a recent onset, this patient would in all probability have a COVID-19. And that has been confirmed that patients have been there who have just loss of smell, and we get them their test done and it turns out to be positive. So
okay, I'll tell the next question.
What should be done right away? Right away, the first thing is to get the RT-PCR done. And as far as the medicines are concerned, one should take symptomatic treatment, which means that if there is a person is having fever or body ache, one should go in for paracetamol. If somebody is having cough, one can go in for a cough syrup.
Okay, what blood tests or investigations are required at what stage? And these blood tests and investigations do not have to start immediately. This virus is an RNA virus, ribonucleic acid. The standard of tests is known as NAT, nucleic acid amplification tests, out of which the gold standard, Dr. Rajiv will talk about it, is the RT-PCR.
So the test is RT-PCR, and for COVID-19, which is taken from the nasal passages and the throat, and which detects the virus. But there is a inherent false negativity rate of around 30%, which means that the patient has COVID-19, but the test still turns out to be negative. In such cases, the organizations, they advocate a repeat test after about 48 hours, or it may not be done at all if in the face of a pandemic, when most likely it would be there. The causes of a false negative test could be the low viral load, or the test is not sensitive enough to pick up the new strains, or maybe an improper technique of taking the swab. So these could be the causes of a false negative test. Other tests are the antigen-based test, which is rapid antigen test, or RAT it's called. It has got a very high false negative rate, around 50%. But then still it is convenient, it is rapid, it gives a rapid result, and logistically it is more convenient.
CREST circulated a treatment protocol flowchart. Would you agree with that completely, or any changes in that?
It's a very good protocol, and it is, in fact, it has been extracted largely from AIMS protocols and the protocols which have been circulated by the Ministry of Health. That's perfectly fine, and it gives very good guidance.
Okay, so we will come to, there are contradictory doctor recommendations in use of many drugs, especially all of us know steroids now. So first, let's just talk of steroids.
So at the outset, the most important thing in COVID-19 is the timeline of corona. The timeline of corona is sort of a life cycle of the chronology of events which take place in the COVID-19. So it is divided into 3 phases, which are component of the acute COVID, which lasts up to about 3 to 4 weeks, and a post-COVID. So we are not going to talk about post-COVID as of today. Acute COVID is divided into 3 phases. First is called the viremic phase, which starts around 2 days prior to the onset of symptoms till about 7 to 8 days post onset of symptoms. In this phase, the virus multiplies in the body, releases certain toxins and chemicals, and causes those symptoms of malaise and body aches, headache, etc. Plus, because it has affected the respiratory passages, so it causes cough and cold and sore throat, etc. There is also evidence of gastrointestinal involvement. So many people, they show signs of diarrhea, abdominal pain. So that, and especially in this particular variant, these gastrointestinal symptoms have been pretty prominent. So this phase lasts for about 6 to 7 days, or rather 8 days. The next phase is the inflammatory phase. Now, inflammation is a process. Inflammation means that the body is reacting to an external stimulus, be it a virus or a bacteria or any other antigen or a stimulant, whether it is internally or from external body. Inflammation is primarily a protective phenomenon. However, at times it may get exaggerated, so which is called an hyperinflammatory response. So inflammatory response is protective, hyperinflammatory response is destructive. This phase lasts from about 6 to 7 days till about 10, 11 days. It is in this phase that the complications appear in those whom they have to appear. It doesn't happen in everyone. Almost 85%, 80 to 85%, or maybe 90% people just have a mild inflammation, and they do not go on to develop hyperinflammatory phase. And these are the people who can be monitored and managed at home. So I'll talk about this. The third one is the convalescent phase, which starts from around 12, 13 days and lasts till about 3 to 4 weeks. Now the entire focus is on the inflammatory phase, because the problems, if they have to start, they start in this phase. And we have to identify as to who are the subset of people who are likely to go into complications. So this is the most crucial step in the management of COVID, because the dilemma comes as to what medicines to give, what investigations to be done. Does the patient can be managed at home? Should the patient be shifted to the hospital?
Yeah, so can you tell us about the red flags and then the role of steroids?
Right. So based on the research, they found that how to identify, because in these times, not only everybody doesn't require hospitalization, and the natural history tells that most of the people would not require hospitalization.
Who don't require hospitalization?
So there are just 2 sets of people who do not require hospitalization: the asymptomatic people, those who have got no symptoms, but maybe because they've come in contact with a positive person, so they turn out, we get a test done upon them and turns out to be positive, number 1. And the other ones are minimally symptomatic people: mild fever, mild cough, no shortness of breath. These are the people who can be kept at home. But even these people, they have to be constantly monitored, because it is not necessary. The course of the disease is very, very variable and very unpredictable. So we have to keep on monitoring them and see for the red flags. So red flags means actually a warning sign. So there are a few red flags which have been identified. The first one, most important, is, so here I'll just make it very clear and very simple to understand. So why do we talk of red flags? Because as we said earlier, the COVID-19 affects the respiratory passages. But so respiratory passages are 2: the upper respiratory passages, nose till the windpipe, trachea, followed by the lower respiratory tract passages, which involves the airways and the lungs. So long as the infection is confined to the upper respiratory tract, there is no problem at all. And in most of the people, it is confined to that only. The problems occur only when the infection or the inflammation extends to the lungs. It is here when the more sinister, more serious signs and symptoms start appearing. So the red flags are shortness of breath, saturation, oxygen saturation dipping less than 94%, very severe cough, tightness in the chest, loss of consciousness, and high fever which persists beyond 7 days, because initially 7 days, that is a part of the viral infection and it subsides. So these are the red flags, and you have to warn the patient whenever we go in for a teleconsultation. We will always warn the patients that you have to watch out for these. So monitoring is very important.
So what are the blood tests you will advise and when?
So as per the guidelines, the moment you find any of the red flags, one should go in for further investigations. The blood tests are a complete blood count in which we have to see basically the ratio of the neutrophils and lymphocytes. Neutrophils and lymphocytes are the white cells. The lymphocytes get this, as the severity of the COVID-19 increases, the lymphocytes get depleted. So NL ratio, high NL ratio would mean a more severe disease. Then the CRP is C-reactive protein. It is a non-specific reaction of the body to any sort of inflammatory trigger. It is not diagnostic. It may be used in monitoring the course of the disease, but by in itself, it is not diagnostic. Third is ferritin. Again, it's an inflammatory marker. Then LDH, lactic dehydrogenase, again an inflammatory marker. Then there are certain tests done for cardiac involvement, TROP-I. Then the test called D-dimer, which is an indicator of the thrombosis or the clotting phenomenon, which is triggered by the inflammatory process.
When will you do these tests?
So these tests should be done only if there is a red flag which is appearing, because the fundamental is that you do not treat the values, you treat the patient. So if there is a patient who says I have having shortness of breath, we would like to get these tests done, and at the same time we would like to also get an HRCT of the chest to find out if there is any lung involvement and what is the extent of lung involvement. This is important because our subsequent therapy would be based on these parameters.
Right. Now let's come to the drugs. So many drugs came up. Let's just talk of the steroids, because everybody now is worried about steroids. So steroids have been used for time immemorial by the medical world for rheumatoid arthritis, for asthma, chronic lung diseases, a lot of glomerulonephritis, kidney diseases. They are savers, life savers, but they have to be used at the correct time. Steroids are immunosuppressants, which means that if when the virus is multiplying, steroids are not treatment for the virus. So when the virus is multiplying and I give steroids, I'm actually causing a flare effect, and I'm asking the bacteria and fungus and virus to grow more. So steroids cannot be given in the initial phase. They have to be given only when the virus is dying down, but it is leaving inflammation in the body. Then to suppress that hyperinflammation state, steroids have to be used. And they have saved millions of lives all over the world. Please understand, steroids are the savior, the only drug we have in COVID apart from the blood thinner. So he'll just tell you something more.
Yeah, so last year into 2020, so initially when the pandemic broke out in several parts of the world, especially on the eastern coast in US, in China and European countries like Germany and Italy. So the protocols were not set. Then the trial by the name of recovery trial was done, and they found, and they used dexamethasone, which is a steroid, and they found that in patients in whom they were supplemental oxygen with, if it was required, and then they were put on dexamethasone for a maximum of 10 days. These patients had a significant difference and they had a more favorable outcome compared to the group which did not have steroids. So that was a landmark study, and that paved the way for incorporation of judicious use of steroids across the COVID illness that's a truly evidence-based treatment.
A lot of drugs came up. We all know them: doxycycline, azithromycin, ivermectin, Fabiflu, colchicine. Tell us about these first. Are they in vogue? Are they recommended?
So since Alka had already said that this is an evolving disease, so we cannot right away condemn any medicine just because it has not been approved. So what the government, what the CDC says, yes, if at all you want to use this drug, they don't condemn them. They don't say that they are bad because there is not enough information available. What they say is, if you want to use that, let it be part of a protocol. Let the patient be informed, yes, these are the medicines which have not yet been approved, and the strength of evidence base is much lesser as compared to the other treatment, and there may be potential side effects. So they can be used. However, they're not yet approved. Like all of them, see, you must be remembering hydroxychloroquine was in a lot of noise when the ex-president of the USA said, yeah, that's a wonderful drug. And then with the same hype, the way it came, and then it was removed because of a lot of side effects. Similarly, Fabiflu and ivermectin. So ivermectin, for example, it's a drug which has been used in many countries, especially in India, this Indian subcontinent, Bangladesh, and UAE, etc. So the small trials have been done in early phases, but then you don't know because they have not been peer reviewed, they have not been published in the top index journals, and so that's why they have not got approval in the advanced countries, but they continue to be used here.
What about remdesivir? Everybody knows remdesivir.
So remdesivir was again introduced last year, and it is an antiviral drug. So therefore, the window of its use is within, say, 8 or 9 days. And the best time is around 5-6 days when the virus is replicating. It has got side effects, especially for adverse kidney effects. But the trial showed that the incremental benefit was just decrease of hospitalization by 1 day. So therefore, in today's time, when there was so much of a scarcity of remdesivir, so even we had discussion within our colleagues, so they said that if you don't get it, that's fine, because there's no significant, not so much of improvement. But there's a conflicting views, like in WHO has sort of removed it from an essential list of medicines, and they no longer advocate it, whereas the USA still continues to do that. So in nutshell, I mean, if we are able to get it, then it's okay, and within the time we are in the right window, the window of the illness, we are in the right window, and it can be given. Let it be given at the same time, observing that the side effects don't occur and the patient is safe to be given that.
Yeah. What about convalescent plasma?
So convalescent plasma was used with the aim that the persons who had recovered from COVID, they were having antibodies. And these antibodies would, when infused in the person who's having COVID, it would attach with the viruses and neutralize the virus and deactivate the virus. A lot of hype was there, and a lot of stress was being, we observed that it was so much of stress upon the patient, and the news was put in the different types of groups. Okay, anybody has this, but then again, there was no controlled trials of this benefit, very dubious benefits, and finally even the government of India has also removed it.
So it has been banned by WHO, and the government of India has also lately removed this. The new drug, which is now in the new DRDO, 2-deoxyglucose. Again, proper phase 3 trials have not been done. This drug has been there since 1956, not been put to any good use. In 2007, it was started. Trials were started for its use as an anti-cancer drugs, because this is a drug. These are basically powder in the form of sachet to be taken orally. So basically the drug, this powder enters the cells which have virus or bacteria, and it does not allow glucose to release energy, that is glycolysis. So if I don't get energy or the virus doesn't get energy, we cannot multiply, we cannot survive. So the virus does not survive. That is the premise on which it has come. Yes, Dr. Reddy Labs Hyderabad, DRDO have approved it. We still need to say whether we have this drug as a wonder drug or no. That's all we can say today regarding it. These are trial phases only. Okay. Now the next question, Dr. Rajiv, is sinus patients already have nose blocks, phlegm, and congestion, and may show low oxygen levels. For example, a maximum of 96, 97. 96 feels too close to 94 threshold. Do we need to worry? What should the sinus patients observe and do differently?
So patients who are having sinus or sinusitis, they need to manage the sinusitis the way they always do. Sinusitis per se does not predispose the person to any worse situation compared to the person who doesn't have sinusitis. So for sinus, they may be doing steam inhalation or taking anti-allergic drugs or the anti-allergic nasal sprays. That has to be done. Now, and this presence of sinusitis doesn't make the oxygen saturation low, because sinus is just affecting the upper airways. It doesn't affect the lower airways, as we had mentioned earlier. So one doesn't need to have any apprehension that somebody is having sinusitis. So you have to have apprehension that it is 96, 97, or very close to 94. I mean, if at all it falls to 94 or less, it is not because of presence of sinus. It is because of the extension of the inflammation.
We will come to the questions on the oxygen concentrator. So we all know that air has 21% oxygen, now natural air, which we breathe in. Concentrator, as the name suggests, concentrates it, and the machinery releases up to 93, 94% oxygen. At lower levels, 2 liters per minute, 3 liters per minute, the concentrators work better. Good concentrators even release even a 5 liter, a heavy concentrator. They have to be more than 20 kg. A heavy concentrator, even at 4 liters, will release 90+% of oxygen. So 5 or 10 liter, maximum we'll get 6, 7, 8% oxygen. Concentrators are not the treatment for COVID. If a mild COVID moves to a moderate or severe level, hospitalization is the gold standard and treatment of choice. Only in the pandemic, when there is a resource crunch, beds are not available, all that, then we have moved to concentrators for the time gap arrangement. Now, under what conditions can we use it at home? If a person's oxygen concentration drops on the second and third day, can we use concentrators?
So person's oxygen levels dropping on the second or third day, it would mean that most likely the person this is not because of COVID, because the drop in oxygen saturation COVID usually takes place in the second phase, which is the inflammatory phase, maybe around day 6, day 7 onwards. So if the oxygen concentration drops on day 1 and day 2, we have to think of it's pretty serious, because in COVID, it is in the early viremic phase, where there are no complications, respiratory complications. So we have to think of non-COVID reasons, maybe a cardiac problem or a pulmonary problem, and they have to be managed and investigated and approached at their own merits. That is a pretty serious problem. And concentration, again, concentrator, because it is not COVID. It could be an acute cardiac problem, or it could be a cardiac failure, or it could be a pulmonary embolism, anything, or pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia.
Should we keep concentrators at home? Should we buy and keep concentrators at home?
I think today's time, difficult for me to answer. As an individual, you always keep it at home, but at least at a community level. For example, we are living in Crest. Now here we have got a reasonable infrastructure, and I think they have made arrangements for about four concentrators, which is good enough, because at best they are interim measures. So if somebody falls sick and somebody is making arrangement for a bed in the hospital, so in the meantime, the oxygen concentrator can be used to tide over the crisis, or to mitigate for that period of time.
Somebody asked that can 2 5 liter per minute concentrators be used together to provide a higher flow rate? So yes, but then how do we give it? So we'll use a nasal prong and we'll use the mask, and it will not double. It won't be that when we use 2, we'll get 8, 9, maybe we'll get 6, 7, 8, because some loss does occur from the nasal prongs or from the side also. So that is there. With the concentrators at home, yes, lot of people have been saved in this pandemic. They have not needed to be hospitalized because they didn't get beds. Ideal is going to hospital. But lot have been saved because they could maintain their saturation to up to 90% plus with the concentrators. And meanwhile, they improved. Everybody didn't deteriorate. Many improved. So the concentrators were helpful. The next question is, how do you value the clinic-like situation at home, Antara, all the daycare things which have come up versus taking the patient to the hospital in the current scenario, which is just it's behind us of overbooked hospitals. Are there any downsides of being in hospitals versus being at home?
I don't think there's a downside being in the hospital, because once the patient is in the hospital, he's part of the system of the hospital. Because see, there are more resources there in the hospital, more infrastructure, better facilities, lab investigations, then the radiology, better oxygen supply. Suppose again the disease is unpredictable. With 5 liters you cannot manage. Suppose we all of us know that patient may be requiring high flow oxygens, like high volume oxygen, 10 liters, 15, 20 liters. They cannot be managed at home.
60 to 70 liters.
Yes, so such high oxygen levels, then maybe repeat CT scans, opinions by pulmonologists, cardiologists, because COVID is a multi-systemic disease. So there are no downsides as such.
So one is our normal oxygen saturation. Then with concentrator, we move up 5-10 points. Then with high flow oxygen of 10 to 20 liters, we may move up some more. Some lungs are so bad, they are not porous, they have become solid. They may need 50-60 liters of oxygen per minute. On another thing which is known as BiPAP. So mask and then BiPAP. BiPAP fits very well. And so initially in New York last year, if you people remember, what we realized, we have a lot of colleagues who are infectious diseases specialists there. They were putting everybody on the ventilator and we were losing people. Gradually they realized everybody doesn't have to go on the ventilator. As the disease evolved, BiPAP is good enough. BiPAP is a non-invasive ventilation. It's like this, it just fits very well. And 60-70 liters of oxygen per minute is pushed in, and then many people improve only on that. The next level is invasive ventilation, the endotracheal tube, what is known as the ventilator, what we call the ventilator. So the hospital setting has the upgraded, we don't know who will need the upgraded facility, who will not. So hospital is always a more secure place than home if hypoxia settles.
But the problem is that since beds were not available, so some option had to be found out. So therefore, the concept of this will come up. But then a lot of drawbacks also, the type of competence of the staff who is managing ward, the medication which have been used. So we have seen that the performance has been rather suboptimal. Somebody has to be there to supervise everything. So it is not a substitute for hospitalization, maybe just at best an interim measure.
These are all intensivists who are trained into ICU settings or anesthetists. A person like Rajiv, when he admits his patient in ICUs, he does it with a team. The pulmonologist, the intensivist, the anesthetist, they are all needed as a teamwork to manage that ventilator. Okay, now the next question. I'm doing steam inhalation once a day. Is it a prevention in any way for the virus? Does it kill the virus?
No, steam inhalation is just purely a symptomatic method to soothe the upper respiratory tracts. It doesn't have any effect on the viruses as such.
Diet restrictions for a COVID patient. There are no diet restrictions. There is no special diet. Any fever per se, any illness per se needs a high protein and a balanced diet with a lot of fruits and salads and good protein, a balanced diet. That's all we need. Any immunity increasing foods, items, supplements that we can take. There is not enough data to say that supplemental zinc or vitamin C or B12 are good. They are being given. Yes, every prescription has it initially, but it's not a grade A evidence-based drug because these are not harmful. These are water-soluble vitamins A, B, and C. They can be taken. We do see some hypertoxic reactions with vitamin B12. People keep taking them for ages. D के साथ तो बहुत होता है because it's a fat-soluble vitamin. But all we need for immunity boosting is good vitamin C in our diet. It could be like an orange juice or nimbu pani or a guava or a kiwi, all sources of vitamin C, multivitamins, 5 colored fruits and vegetables every day, the purple, the red, the orange, the green, and the yellow, all together on a platter gives us enough B12 and C Yes, lot of proteins to tide away any breakdown in the body. These are the immunity building. Yes, one can take some vitamin C, 500 up to 1000 is allowed milligrams, and B complex. Zinc has been talked a lot. Zinc is there again in the high protein foods. Red meat and seafood, and mainly lobsters and crabs, and poultry has zinc. Lot of our rajma, kala chana, kabuli chana, chickpeas, soya beans, they're good source of zinc. Wheat is a good source of zinc. We have enough zinc in our diet. One thing which has come up today in the medical WhatsApp thing is maybe too much of zinc. Maybe too much of zinc is causing mucormycosis. So, another antenna has come up now today. Okay, the next question is, any breathing or other exercises? Yes, we all know. Take in deep breath, breathe through the nose. Breathe out slowly through the mouth. Pranayam, deep breathing exercises, what we need. Kapalbhati, Anulom Vilom are all good. Any deep breathing exercises to increase our lung capacity, along with lot of walking at home.
In fact, here in Lighterview, I would like to tell that these techniques, they have been there in our culture for such a long time. But now they have got endorsement from the American organizations and the American Lung Association. Now they say, okay. So I was just reading from my resource that up to date. I'm telling Alka, ये तो अनुलोम विलोम में क्या है कि नोज बंद करके करो, breathe यहाँ से वहाँ से करो, या deep breathing करो, you raise your diaphragm. So that has always been there. But now maybe that they have probably stood the scrutiny of the tests, and so that's why they are promoted and they called lung exercises.
What should we be particularly careful about to prevent catching the virus? Yeah, no.
I think that's the standard, and it should be knowledge. Not only it has to be implemented. Masking, then social distancing, and hand washing. The fundamentals.
Does a combination of flu shot and COVID vaccine provide greater protection?
Yes. So since last year, several reports have come up that patients who had already been given the flu shot, they compared the groups. They were less likely to be suffering, contracting the COVID-19, and if at all they did, the intensity was attenuated in these patients. But then this has to be subject to, this calls for a larger study. But at the same time, flu vaccine is mandatory on its own merits and it should be taken.
The world has to take it. Anybody above 6 months of age has to take an annual flu vaccine. The time is running short, so we'll just run through the questions and not detail too much on these things. So there are quite a few cases of severe COVID infections, deaths even despite 2 jabs of the vaccine. Are these mostly in pre-existing comorbidities or are there unknown factors? Right?
This is very, again, this has to be subject. It's a subject of research whether actually it is happening or not, because one doesn't know. One may be the incubation period of the virus at the time of vaccination, or one may be contracting the infection at the vaccination site.
And vaccinations are not 100%.
So, and vaccinations no vaccine claims to be having 100% protection, effectiveness in preventing the new infection.
Also, is it safe for 60 plus to take long haul flights after the 2 jabs?
So the answer would be that the long haul flights, the precautions are applicable independent of the presence of COVID or vaccination, because as such the downside is the prevention of increased risk of thrombosis, presence of thrombosis in the legs, veins, because you are sitting on the seat. So the best thing would be to take a walk in the aisle at periodic intervals. When you are sitting, move your legs, and I'm sure these instructions are also lying behind the seat in the aircraft.
A lot of hydration.
Lot of hydration. Then many people advocate the use of stockings. So if you're going on any flight beyond 6 hours, you should wear stockings, so that would promote the venous return and prevent thrombosis.
What to do if the second dose of vaccination, because of anxiety, is not available even after 12 to 16 weeks? So see, any vaccination, even the first dose is protective, maybe up to 70-75%. Second dose, we will move up in percentage. Now, this is a government protocol, government program. None of us can interfere with it. If government is short, government cannot give us vaccines. 12 to 16 weeks, even 6 months, we will have to wait. Don't get anxious about it. One dose has given us good amount of protection. Keep the preventive aspects, the face, space, and the hands. That is what is needed. So next question is, how safe is it to travel in the lift or take a walk in the garden area? How can we minimize the risk in that case? I am going to read, so there was a study which has been carried out by Otis Elevators with the University of Purdue. It was a 3-month study done for the elevators, and the results were announced in January 2001. I quote, they showed that exposure risk on a short elevator ride is lower compared to many other everyday activities. And the proper use of masks and air purification further reduce this exposure. Since it's an airborne infection, so we do understand that. We used to talk of aerosol. Aerosol are big particles more than 5 microns, which 0.5 microns, which 5 microns, yeah, which the flu virus was subjected to, and we were told to stay away 3 feet. With COVID, we moved to 6 feet because we thought it was traveling further. And now even 10 meters yesterday, somebody has announced inside room space. So now airborne means that these are smaller particles, less than 3 microns, which stay hanging in the air even after we have walked away. They are not droplets which are falling down, which means that we have to be less exposed. So elevators have a mandatorily coded higher level of air exchange and vents, which helps in droplet dispersion. We can lower the risk by decreased time of travel, usually a minute, no repeated travel, not to go in crowded lifts, and double masking decreases further the risk by 50%. And there are certain purification solutions for air purification. We won't know about it, these are technical things, but there are certain purification solutions, air purifiers, which suck in those airborne thing and throw it out from the lift. So these measures have to be taken. Masks, as far as masks are concerned, N95 are polypropylene plastic masks, which are for them, which are advised. The US CDC, everybody says all the bodies leave them for the medical world who are in close contact with the patients. These prevent 95% of the infections. Also a double masking by a surgical mask and then a multi-layer cloth mask will also give us 95% protection if it is put in properly, which means the nose bridge has to be there, the cloth mask over the disposable mask, knotting the air loops of the disposable mask, using also now available in the market mask braces. These are tighteners, fitters over here, which they help. They go like this over the mask. And so these are the strategies to improve the fit. Okay, so now the next question is, any special precautions or palliative medicines advised for 75 plus, especially those with multiple comorbidities after they have taken their 2 jabs? What are the risks of getting COVID with comorbidities? What tests need to be done to detect early signs of COVID with these complications?
So the first question, any special precautions with palliative medicines? No, there's no specific medicine to be taken for prevention in 75 plus. It is just that any person who is having comorbidities, such comorbidities should be managed as per the advice given by their treating doctors. For example, diabetes. Now, if somebody has diabetes, the diabetes should be under good control, because it is not that such people with comorbidities have higher incidence of infection, but if these people with comorbidities, they develop this infection, the severity of infection is higher in these people. So the comorbidities have to be managed as per the treatment which has been advised to them earlier.
Steroids are causing black fungus. What do we need to know about use of steroids? Especially what not to do so that the disease can be arrested before it progresses to that dangerous black fungus stays. What are the symptoms? What is this fungus infection? What are the early signs? How can we prevent it?
So there's a lot of debate. One thing is there that the number of this mucormycosis or the black fungus is much larger in India as compared to the rest of the world. I was just going through literature, and the number of cases which have been reported in the entire world between say 10 or 15 past years, such number is probably already exceeded in India. Why this is happening at such a rapid and unbelievable pace, one doesn't know, and people are trying to figure out as to why this is happening. Like, for example, steroids have been put as a culprit, but not necessarily, because our rheumatologists, colleagues, they say that they have been using steroids for decades, and their patients do not get mucormycosis. So it is just an observation. There's a lot of debate is going on as to why this is happening. But the common factors are that people who are having diabetes, uncontrolled, severe uncontrolled diabetes, along with injudicious or excessive use of steroid, they are one of the sets of people who are getting mucormycosis. But also there are many reports there where there is no comorbidity and no risk factor. Even those people are getting have suffered from mucormycosis.
Masks have to be washed very nicely. Mask could be a cause of this black fungus, necrosis here coming up. So please wash your masks regularly. Throw away the disposable surgical face masks and wash the face masks every day. Hang them in the sun. Sun is the best thing for us. You know, so that is there.
Symptoms to watch out are, so if such a background exists, so this black fungus or the mucormycosis effect, this is called rhino orbital cerebral mucormycosis. Rhino means nose, orbital means the orbit is the eye orbit, this, and the brain. It's essentially, it starts as a sinusitis, beginning the nose getting blocked. So the best thing would be to consult an ENT specialist, ideally in person, so that he sees if there's anything suspicious, and then they advise to go in for a CT scan or an MRI of the sinuses and the orbits and brain, and then take a decision about that.
Gangaram
How
has
to manage.
intestinal.
So today there was a news item that in Gangaram an intestinal mucormycosis was reported.
They have operated on 2 cases yesterday or day before, and they had to resect 1 foot of the intestine because people came with abdominal discomfort, and 2 mucormycosis have been reported. Rajiv has been seeing 1 to 2
We had
cases
referred them to Gangaram Hospital
every day. Yeah. So our ENT surgeon at Gangaram, Dr. Monga, Anil Monga Senior, he has operated on 2 of his patients recently in the last 2-3 days. Amphotericin B, the drug of choice, is in short supply, and definitely that now the thing has moved from oxygen. We have enough oxygen in the city, but amphotericin B is something. There was something about the white fungus. That was a misnomer and a myth. There is no white fungus. White fungus is the common candida which we are seeing for ages. Again, because of too much of mask and oxygen and maybe not proper hygiene, the fungus goes and sits there and has to be treated. So it's the common candida organism which is there. And
so the next question is about post-COVID. So post-COVID is a period, although arbitrarily defined, because COVID there is a continuum of disease and symptoms in COVID-19. But UK says post-COVID, the period beyond 21 days from the onset of first symptom, and USA they say it as after 28 days of the first onset of symptoms. Now the quarantine, so they say that quarantine should be, so the patient should exit quarantine after 10 days. In addition to 10 days, 1 day without any fever and without the use of any antipyretic or anti-fever drugs. So the person can come out of quarantine on the 12th day without any RT-PCR test, because many times the RT-PCR test comes out positive. It does not indicate the person is infective. It just indicates that he's shedding inactive, non-infective virus.
so last two questions about pregnant women. Pregnancy and childbirth does not increase the risk of acquiring infection. But once a pregnant lady gets COVID, she becomes again a high risk, like a diabetic. A pregnant lady is high risk for getting COVID infection. So that is there, and it has to be treated as per the COVID norms. In which trimester is there the most risk for pregnant women? We don't like infections in the first trimester, any kind of infection when the baby's parts, embryogenesis is taking place in the first 9 weeks of pregnancy. I'm happier if my infections occur after 12 weeks. Second trimester, the mid 3 months is okay to get the infection because we are not in a hurry to deliver the baby at that time. It's not a viable pregnancy. Third trimester, we fear COVID because many times if the mother is moving from mild to moderate COVID, we will have to intervene for the baby's sake. And this is what is known as an iatrogenic preterm delivery. The doctor has to induce a vaginal or a cesarean delivery to save 2 lives, both the mother and the baby. COVID is a prothrombotic condition. We all know D-dimer, which increases in COVID. Pregnancy is also a prothrombotic condition. So 2 conditions which cause more thrombosis, more clotting together becomes high risk. So I would take out my baby, albeit preterm, because I have to save my mother and I'm scared for my baby also. We are not still sure if there is transplacental migration of COVID to the baby, but I would take out, and that's why we are having a lot of preterm babies now in nurseries post when mothers have become moderate or severe COVID. And obviously the morbidity mortality goes up in the babies. Mothers can be saved better when the pressure of pregnancy goes away. That is there because her condition reverts to a non-pregnant state. So the question is also, can pregnant women take the vaccine? In which trimester? Which vaccine is preferable, Covishield or the inactive Covaxin? Pfizer and Moderna have been approved both for pregnant women and for lactating women. Recently, ICMR has just approved, Ministry also of Health and Family Welfare in India, have just approved the vaccines for lactating women. They are still not approved for the pregnant lady, even though our Federation of Obs and Gynae Society of India has repeatedly told the ministry, please give it in pregnant ladies also. We give influenza vaccine mandatorily to all our pregnant ladies after the first trimester. I will not vaccinate a lady in the first trimester because, God forbid, abortions occur more in the first trimester. If it happens, it will be labeled to the vaccine. So I don't want to stress out on that, but second trimester, third trimester, I think the approval should be coming from the government. The FOGSI is putting a lot of pressure for the pregnant women. They should be taking the Covishield or Covaxin as the suggestion, but we cannot give it until unless the government approves of it, ICMR and the ministry. So that is where we stand with all our questions. And for us, we have completed all the questions now. Any 1 or 2 questions are coming, we are ready to answer.
Thank you so much. Firstly, on behalf of the entire community, Alka and Rajiv, thank you. This has been super useful. And I think, just speaking for myself, this has been one of the best conversations we've had, so well informed and so objective. So firstly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Alka.
There have been 2 questions that have come up on the chat. If there is a minute, so I'll just. And I think one is the question from Renu, who said, is it okay to mix vaccine? There have been some cases where people have gone to foreign countries and taken a different vaccine. Do you think that's a good idea? And the second one, I think, is that, sorry.
Yeah. Let me answer this. So we got our Covishield in January, first dose as doctors from Fortis Shalimar Bagh. And February 18th, we had taken a second shot. And I have been asking the medical world, if we go to US by chance in July, August, and Pfizer is now easily available there, can we go and take a shot? Till date, we have a lot of batchmates in research and who are working on these vaccines. Nobody has given an affirmative answer. The latest I've got 2 days back by one of my batchmates from LA. She's in the research section of one of the drug companies and vaccine companies. She said, If we get a booster dose of Pfizer by then, please understand, booster dose is a low activity vaccine. It's not the actual vaccine, it's a low dose vaccine. If we get a booster dose Pfizer by then 6 months later, you can take the vaccine. That is all the medical world will say. We feel that, okay, this is out of the book, off label. And 6 months, maybe our immunity is going down now. We don't know how long these vaccines are giving us immunity. We may like to take Pfizer vaccine by the end of 6 months, at least one shot.
Formal recommendation.
There is no formal recommendation. We cannot speak for anybody on this for now. And we cannot mix vaccines. If you have taken one dose of Covishield, you have to take the Covishield only as the second dose. You cannot mix vaccines. Second question, Nalin?
Second actually was from one of our more fitter members. He said that in case you're able to walk up the stairs to your flat, is that safer than taking the elevators?
He is walking up. He is walking up.
I mean, I've never thought about this, whether it is safer or not, but just for the purely from a physical exercise point of view, I sometimes at least once when I go to pick up the newspaper, so I go down the staircase and come up the staircase.
With the double mask, obviously.
With the double mask, because we don't
And
know.
because people are not walking up the staircase nowadays. So the staircase are practically out of the airborne range.
Thank you. I think Manju has a question.
Yeah, Manju.
Yes, first of all, I joined Ravi in thanking both of you. It was really excellent. I think you've already covered it, but just for another confirmation on the steroids, you did mention that it's in the second phase. So is there a totally, in that second phase, is there a totally outer limit when, as a patient, you should know that the steroid should stop, like from day 8 to which day? And which among these steroids is the best? How many?
Right.
One doesn't know. Yeah,
That's
so
very-
that you are yourself
That's
conscious.
That's right. So steroids are not medicines which should be used to reducing fever. What is happening is that because of and see, it will not be the fault of the patient. The patient wants relief. If he's having 102, 103 fever, so the tendency is to put steroids, and the steroids, because of the mechanism of action, the temperature just comes down. That is not the indication of steroids. So steroids have to be decided based upon the overall, the acuity of the situation in terms of the oxygen levels and in terms of shortness of breath, extent of lung involvement, and all these things. So now the steroid which have been used in the trial are dexamethasone, because that has got the maximum evidence base. And in that particular trial, the dose was 6 milligram per day for a maximum of 10 days.
Please understand, steroid should not be given beyond 10 days.
In acute COVID.
This is very important. People, we have seen so many patients getting
Just going
secondary
on and on,
infections.
on and on.
People are coming with so many infections and bad diabetes because they are eating steroid for 20, 25
So
days.
the best is dexamethasone, but in India, because the number of patients which is seen in India is very large. So we should not question the experience. So there they have been using methylprednisolone in all the big hospitals, methylprednisolone, or you must have heard Solumetrol, or the oral preparation, Medrol, etc. So these patients, yes, but then on an OPD basis, the government, the regulatory authority, they do not recommend steroids to be used in a domiciliary treatment in the home. If the patient has to be given steroid, he is sick. He should be in the hospital, and he should be on supplemental oxygen.
Stop.
So that would just be an interim or a stopgap arrangement. Now the duration, maximum duration is 10 days. The minimum duration is the moment the patient is discharged from the hospital and he returns home, you should stop steroids because the indication of steroid is over. Third, there is a lot of trend towards tapering of the steroids. You know, 32 milligram prednisolone पहले दिया, फिर उसको 16 करो, 8 करो, उसको करो. No. If the steroids have been used for 21 days or less, they can be stopped abruptly without any tapering. So this is what this scientific and from the authorities, this is what it is. So see what happens is if you keep on tapering, so the final amount of steroid which has been going to the body exceeds significantly. And at the same time, once you start steroids in a patient, as a part of your transparency, you should tell the patient, I as a doctor, I should tell the patient, yes, we are using steroids. These are the reasons why we are using steroids. But the flip side, downside is that if you have got sugar, it may get aggravated, it may get worsened. If you do not have diabetes, if you're having a pre-diabetes, your diabetes may get precipitated for a short duration of time. Third, there is always a chance of developing other infections, bacterial infections or fungal infections, like urinary tract infection. So patients come, they said, we're absolutely fine, our RT-PCR is negative. And after 1 week or 10 days from discharge from the hospital or from the from the quitting of the quarantine, they said, I'm started having fever, 101 starting chills. And then he found that urinary tract infections are fairly common occurring. So that becomes a very tough challenge. I mean, post-COVID, fevers occurring. I mean, recently also when I was following a patient, then I felt that the patient required hospitalization post-COVID. Then he referred to one of the leading hospitals there. Went on giving steroids. Then I had a word with the doctor. Why are you giving steroids? Inflammation. There's no inflammation as such. There is a gap. So the patient gets well from COVID. There's a gap of around 5-6 days, and the patient starts having fever. So there has to be something new, some new infection. You have to put in your efforts there. Whatever you want to give, you give antifungus or antibiotics, something else, but not steroids. Because if it's a bacterial infection, it's again going to proliferate and increase. So then they go understood. Then, I mean, it was a tough time for me to convince them, being in a remote consultation. I'm not a part of the hospital, but then they stopped steroids. So that thing is there. I mean, you have to go by the protocols. See, protocols, you may not be doing extra benefit because that probably doesn't exist. At least you would be doing no harm. That's very non-nocere. There is a saying in, they say, do no harm. That is the first principle of medicine, do no harm.
Look, I know we probably run over your time, so thank you. There was just one last question, Ravi Savani. He's saying that if he didn't perfectly understand the question, if he has an opportunity to take a booster shot of Covishield after 12 weeks, which means it's probably a third shot, is that advisable?
No, not as per guidelines. Only 2 shots as now are approved. We still do not know when we will require the booster shot, or will there be no booster shot? Like, we don't know whether it will be an annual vaccine from now on in our lives, or 6 monthly. All these will come up. See, there are phases. There are phase 0 to phase 4 trials, which take years. This is all emergency use authorization. So we still don't know. In phase 1 trial, only 15 patients are put to, their permission is taken. And they are given a low dose of that drug, just to see side effect to nahi aayenge. And then in the next phase, little bigger number is taken, 20 to 80, and the side effects and the efficacy is studied. Then the phase 3 trials come with US FDA approvals and all, where then a larger in hundreds number, and then it moves to 3,000. And side effects and efficacy. So placebos are also given. Patients are enrolled for the trials. They are not told whether they are actually getting the drug or they are getting the placebo. And then the statistics is formed over years, and only then the drug is released in the market. This time we haven't had the opportunity. The pandemic just came on us. So even COVID, the settlements will come over years. I must tell you, there is a very good site which we subscribe to annually for last 16 years. It's for doctors and laymen both, uptodate.com. There is a lot of information for laymen. So this is a site worldwide where experts from all over the world, all the world bodies, every 15 days review that particular subject. Everything medical on the earth is there on that. We subscribe, we pay $600 every year. And that's where, if we had complicated cases, I have somebody throwing fits with pregnancy, I will fatafat open my UpToDate, read the latest guidelines, because I don't want to do 9 out of 10. I want to do 10 out of 10. And guidelines are changing every few days. So even you people can all go on to UpToDate. It gives very good information. You can't log in for many
welcome.
articles.
You're welcome. You can any query on any sort of medical topic, just pass it on to me. That's my passion. I like to do that. So
yeah, I know. So
You both.
at least we can be of that much use to the society.
Let's
Give
give
back.
one last question to Manoranjan and then we'll close this meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you, doctors Rajiv and Alka. This is Manoranjan.
Hi.
Again and again it comes up that diabetics are at a much greater risk for complications. What about pre-diabetics? For instance, if a GP says you are pre-diabetic, you don't really have to bother, much. Just continue with your life as you are. Just be a little careful. But in these times, do pre-diabetics have to take extra precautions just so that they are, let's say, they are able to bring down the sugar levels a little, just in case they get an infection?
No, see the natural history of pre-diabetes. Pre-diabetes is blood sugar of fasting blood sugar of 100 to 125, fine, or the HbA1c of 6.4, 5.5 to 6.4. So pre-diabetes, the natural history pre-diabetes, the pre-diabetes, many of them they just remain like this. Their blood sugars remain in this range only, or they might, in some of them who are very aggressive with their lifestyle, they may get down further. HbA1c comes to 5.2, 5.3, or they may go on to progress to diabetes. So who is going to progress to diabetes? Mainly people who are not very rigorous with their life, the day-to-day life and the lifestyle, diet and exercise, etc. So they may go on to develop frank diabetes. So there's nothing to show that if somebody is having pre-diabetes, somebody is having a fasting blood sugar of say 110, you have to bring it down further. There is no evidence to show this. But people who are having diabetes, their diabetes should be meticulously controlled. Why? Because last year, a lot of trials were done in India, also in Kolkata, they found that they saw in one of the tertiary care hospital that compared diabetes patients. So there they sort of, what is their blood sugar levels? Patients who had uncontrolled diabetes at the time of admission, had a suboptimal outcome vis-a-vis those people whose diabetes was controlled. So that's the difference. So for pre-diabetes, you have to behave and they carry on your day-to-day life the way it has always been done.
Thank you.
Ravi, before you close it, I just wanted to thank Sunaina also for putting together today's this thing, collecting the questions. Over to you, Ravi.
No, actually, over to Sunaina, I have done nothing but sort of be told to sort of bring this together. So they've done all the work. But I think on behalf of everybody, Rajiv and Alka, thank you so much. As we've said before, this has been deeply meaningful to everybody. And thank you for taking the time.
And thank you everyone for contributing your excellent questions. I think we have
The
a
news
big
has just come in, Sunaina. The news has
Hanji.
just come in that Delhi lockdown has been extended to 31st. I just saw that. And I don't know, Haryana yesterday, the minister has said we may open shops from Monday.
Yes.
So I don't know. I think it should be in a graded manner. Otherwise, we are heading for another bad show. So
Can
let us
already
see.
see.
Rajiv from us. Thank you.
Unmute.
Yeah.
Big thanks. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.